Bill, you want to step
Well,
in first?
I just first, Steve Hill over there and Bob over here are two historic players for me, and so it was a joy to listen to you two guys speak and teach me a lot. Look, you've been on the show a million times, and we keep talking about how to make it work. Go a little bit further into how the random sampling strategy, or whatever it is to get the citizen person to a constitution. To me, it sounds the best. No baggage, no self-interest, none of us political. You let the real people be there and let them figure out the future instead of everybody's special interests. So explain a little more.
A little bit more detail. Am I on? Okay. And actually, I should say, there's a website, reformcalifornia.org, as well as another one, repaircalifornia.org. We need to do both reform and repair. But on reformcalifornia.org, we have a report about all this, so you can see that, and also about the plan that Mark Paul talked about is also on reformcalifornia.org. Here's how it would work to do the random sample. Is first they would start with, if we're going to have 400 members, delegates, that would be 5 per assembly district. So they would mail to, about 20,000 people per assembly district, and they would say, they would explain a little bit in this letter, do you want to be part of this constitutional convention? You would be paid for it. This is about how long it would take. They would put some details into that letter. If you'd like to be part of this, then you need to come to a meeting. They would come to a meeting, and out of the 20,000 or so who've been mailed to, you see how many show up. Usually a few hundred show up. And you say, okay, explain a little bit more about how many still want to be on it. At that point, the numbers will dwindle, but there'll still be enough to then do a random sample of those who want to be on it, where they would just, of the people who are still in the running, so to speak, would be randomly selected from this assembly district. And they do this in all the assembly districts around California. And then they would look at the overall pool of 400, and they would look to see how representative of California is this in terms of ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and all these different ways. And I mean, some of the details are still being discussed, but if it was lacking in a certain way, then there would be the ability to add another 10 or 15 members in order to plug that hole in the diversity of California. That's a short version of how we would do it, but these things have been done in many, many places, and they work. There's no question about it. You can get a scientifically representative sample of California. In New Orleans, for example, when they did that in the example I discussed, when they did, they asked everyone with their keypad polling devices in the first meeting to answer a bunch of demographic questions, and not only was it representative, but it was representative before Katrina, not after Katrina, both in terms of socioeconomic. A quarter of the people made $25,000 or less who were there, as they did before Katrina. And in terms of African-American participation, it's a highly African-American city. It was, I think, like 55 to 60% of the delegates in that were African-American. So these methods do work.
Just like Bill did on his program in anticipating your questions, the question that he asked there anticipated many of yours. There were follow-ups on this point. So since several of you submitted, Nancy's going to follow up with a few of those and read them.
Yeah, there's great interest in this area. And we have questions such as, what about students? How do they get to participate? How about people with jobs where they can't take 8 months off? Folks were concerned that maybe this would be like a jury pool where a lot of people opt out. We also had someone note that we're not very diverse up here. So how are we encouraging and ensuring diversity in any kind of process? And I think those were some of the general themes. So I think the audience would be interested in different points of view on this.
One of the nice things about working at New America is that we don't have a party line. So this is a subject that Stephen and I have had some disagreement about on the idea of the jury pool, and which I like is the idea of deliberative democracy. But I want to raise one issue for all of you to think about, and that is that no matter what the convention does, and no matter how it's selected, to get from a series of ideas to a new constitution is going to require a political process. And it ultimately means at the end that the voters of California are going to have an up or down vote on a new constitution. And so we have to think about, what that final process is going to be like. And all of you, we've seen the initiative process in California. When some moneyed interest has enough at stake in something, They are willing to raise and spend enormous sums of money to confuse the hell out of California voters. I happened to do some work in 2006 on the clean energy measure that was on the ballot that year. Prop 84. I'm forgetting the numbers. I'm getting old, but it involved investing in clean alternative energy in California for transportation and the like, financed with an oil severance tax, California being the only jurisdiction in the world that does not have a severance tax on oil. And as a result of that one provision, the oil companies raised and spent about $80 million and killed it. Mm-hmm. So, I think we need to remember that if we're going to get a new constitution passed, we have to have working up to a political process where we have buy-in from enough of the substantial moneyed players in California that they're not going to go out and try to kill it. And that is what happened in California back in the 1960s. California had a revision commission in the 1960s. That's where we got the full-time legislature. And a lot of the changes in what was the original 1879 Constitution were done in the 60s. But none of that would have happened except that there was a very carefully worked out political deal between business and labor where they were involved in the Constitutional Revision Commission process, and they agreed to get together and run a joint campaign, and eventually almost all those measures were passed by voters.
Well, I think it's obviously one of the most critical parts of this process will be how do people serve and how do they get there? And Steve has come up with a very interesting idea. Just as a footnote, there's also going to be a reapportionment, a redistricting commission that I hope most of you will apply for. This will actually take applications. And a group will do the redistricting for the legislature, unlike this last decade where the legislature did it themselves. And that's another process to look at. There, in that situation, you actually apply for it, and you can be disqualified for a number of reasons, that you've been a candidate or a public official or you've given so much money. But then there'll be a review panel taking a look at the applications, and then there'll be eventually a random drawing of 8 members, and the 8 members then will pick the other 6 to reflect the diversity of California to end up with 14. Now that's quite a bit different from 200, 300, 400, but there will be a process in place where we will have a citizens commission doing the redistricting for the legislature, and that's another alternative way of picking people for the Constitutional Convention.
Well, so other places that have done this, they do the work on the weekends, so your work week is not disrupted. But I think for this case, we're thinking that it's probably going to be more involved than that. So, the pay that's being entertained would actually be quite substantial. In fact, some people have said that the delegates should be paid as much as state legislators would get paid. And so it would entail, however, like in a jury selection process, you are entitled to take time off from your work and then to go back to your job. So there would be something in the provision to make sure that you would be able to go back to your job. But unlike a jury process, you would get paid. Jury process, you don't get anything, but sometimes you get a per diem, but it's not very much money. So, pardon? Well, this would be through the initiative process. This would be through the initiative process. The initiative would have a certain amount of money in it to pay for this constitutional convention. And not only has to pay for delegates, it has to pay for staff. The educational process is extremely important. You have to have staff that do that in a very fair and impartial manner. So there's lots of details like this that are going to have to go into the initiative.
Okay, we got a series of questions that are similar in this sense. In the spirit of the reforms you're proposing, would it not make sense to get the legislature to call a convention? Has the legislature been approached regarding calling a convention? Could they be shamed into doing so, accelerating the process? Why has it taken 130 years to have another constitutional convention? Who is financing this effort to create a new convention? Who can walk us through how these 2 initiatives are going to get on the ballot in 2010? Where is organized labor in supporting the convention? Yes, Jim, these are all coming to you.
Back from where I'm from, they said oy vey, so that's what I say now. Well, in terms of the financing, So far, most of the financing for this came from a grant from the Hewlett, Bill and Flora Hewlett Foundation, a couple of $100,000. So it's not a whole lot of money just to seed it. And the reason that they gave that money to the Bay Area Council Foundation on top of a grant they had given us to help engage the business community, talk about education reform for the next few years. And they felt that when we explained the Constitutional Convention, they actually volunteered this money, we did not ask for it, that they gave us this grant because they felt that the Constitutional Convention could aid and abet education reform, which is, at least for this part of the Hewlett Foundation, the major focus, because unless you have a legislative body that can get things done, why, you're probably not going to be able to achieve very much in education reform, mostly, which is contained in the Education Code, which is statute, not, that's one of the few things not in the California Constitution. So that's, I guess, the answer on that is going forward on financing. What we intend to do is we intend to take a page out of President Obama's campaign and try to raise most of the money for this going forward, which is going to take a lot of money over a lot of time with small contributions from people like you guys. So, get ready for that. But that's the way it really should be. The great thing about the Constitutional Convention is that it can be owned by the people. And the example was given of I think it's 87 a couple of years ago, which was that excise tax and the clean energy bill. And that's the typical approach, right? I mean, there's an initiative, you don't know anything about it, you find out about it when you're watching TV one day in September maybe, and you see a commercial, and then you see another commercial, and then there are opposing commercials, and you can tell that a lot of money is getting spent on both sides, and then you're just frustrated and you don't want to turn on the television anymore because they're overwhelming you with information, and in your heart you really don't know the facts. And it's and all that. But this is different. This is an opportunity for a real conversation with California amongst its citizens about what the state needs, going forward. And if you look at it, it's probably, if one of the downsides of it is it takes a while to make it happen, one of the upsides is we have a chance to maybe have even a slightly dispassionate, really thoughtful Q&A that takes place over months and months and a couple of years, so that by the time we get to vote on this thing, both for the convention and then a couple of years later for the reforms that would be recommended, we'd really understand what they were about, and maybe more importantly, we would feel some sense of ownership. Because whether you thought that Prop 87 was a good idea or a bad idea, you certainly didn't feel any pride of ownership in the thing because you didn't know anything about it until shortly before your absentee ballot showed up in the mail. So this is a very different kind of process, and again, I would urge you to think a little bit differently about what civics could be like when it comes to reforming our state. And it isn't the piecemeal approach as Assemblymember Brownlee talks about. What's going to happen on the 2010 ballot is you're going to see all these separate initiatives going forward. Coming out of the meeting of the summit today of the local governments and the school districts, I'll bet you their decision will be to gin up a ballot measure that directs state funds into local coffers in some better way with some management control for that. And that may be a good idea, but you'll have all these different measures, you'll get confused, they'll be fighting for airtime and all of that kind of thing. When what really should happen is there should be a broad system-based conversation about how to take what we've got and fix it and move forward from there.
I think there was one question about the legislature.
Yeah,
let me address that.
But the irony there, or the reality there, is that the legislature can do this. It requires, guess what, a 2/3 vote for that to happen. So I think,
and we do have bills. We approach this, and we have bills in both houses. And there's a Republican bill by, I think it was Assemblymember Blakesley, who's now Minority Leader Blakesley in the Assembly, and Senator DeSaulnier in the Senate, who was actually the person who gave us the idea of the Constitutional Convention, sort of in an offhanded way, when we went up there 9 months ago. So there are a couple of bills, and then we submitted a bill with the language that's essentially the sort of stalking horse language that we have at this point. But we suspect that at the end of the day, the consideration of these bills hasn't been robust, and the reason for that is they've been, working on the budget. So there, Senator Hancock from Berkeley has called. I've been asked to testify at a hearing on this process 3 times, and then I get a message back that the hearing's been canceled because they're working on the budget. So one of these days, maybe we'll get done with the budget and we can have a discussion. But to get to the 2/3 vote, to bring this out and put a constitutional convention, that's the way it should be done. I mean, the California state legislature, more than any other body, should understand that if ever there was a time to reach out to the public to reform itself, this would be it. And the fact that they don't do it should tell you something. And I really commend you for being here and bringing this message. And I met yesterday with Assembly members Ruskin and Fuentes, who want to bring forward a constitutional revision commission. And we said we're all for it. I mean, do whatever it takes. That you need to have different approaches working side by side. Constitutional convention, you need to start working on it now in order to have it. If we don't start now and begin collecting signatures pretty soon and finalize language, you can forget about that. The legislature can act much more quickly if they decide to do it, because the power of constitutional revision actually falls largely with the legislature. So they have it if they want to go ahead and do it. And we absolutely would urge the legislature to come together and forget, try to have a new conversation and move forward with this. But assuming that that's not too likely to happen, we need to, figure out as citizens, how to go about doing this, and that's what we're doing.
Well, let me make one prediction. The legislature will not do it.
Okay, quick follow-up from Bill.
Yeah, just real quickly, the power's got to be in the hands of the people. The people have to get it on the ballot. It will force this governor's race in 2010 to have a significant issue. Every candidate, are you for the Constitutional Convention or not? It will dynamically throw it into the political process. We've got to get it together by the 25th of September so we can kick the process in gear. And if a miracle happens and the legislature really can get its act together, this will be the impetus. This will be the potential club, and they can play the carrot if they want. But we have to take leadership now. Time has run out.
Okay, just one more quick follow-up question on leadership. Is Prop 13 on the table? If so, why? If not, why?
13?
Prop 13? 13? Any of you heard of that one?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the earlier remarks, 13, everything that ties to the governance and fiscal system we think should be on the table. We wrestled with this, and I always felt it absolutely should be, because Prop 13 occupies so much of the space, which affects how California is run or not, that we need to do that. But then there's the third rail theory, and that theory extends beyond Prop 13. There's these things people tell us, well, if you include that, I mean, this gets to Mark's thing, that if you tick off this or that special interest group, then therefore they're going to put up huge amounts of money. We already have the taxpayer groups essentially lined up against us for doing this and so forth, because that's their, that's where they have their stake, and that's their arena of power, is in Proposition 13 and the related issues to that. But, I think we're at the point, ladies and gentlemen, where we have to say, look, all of this is true. I mean, there's these tremendous special interests. They have a lot of money and power and lawyers, and they have all of these things, and we know it. But we're seeing the beginnings of the unraveling of our society. That's right. And, we may not want to face it, but we're seeing it. It doesn't necessarily get better from here, just because maybe the stock market went up or something for a couple of days because, somebody thinks that, because Goldman Sachs knows how to make money in a quarter, that, America is back. I mean, I don't think so. So, we better take some action, and we better prepare, and we better build some walls. And I think we can inoculate, if you can use a thought like that, the California citizenry against these attacks, because there haven't been meetings like this. And if we do this 1,000 times over the next period of time, all over the state, and that's what we're starting to do, and we support that, then by the time this the results, if we do it right, the recommendations from these citizens will stand up in biblical proportion. And if anybody attacks them, the question is going to be who's attacking it and why. And what's your interest? Why would you attack what the citizens of California came together to do? And so, money is money. It's very, very powerful. But on the other hand, the people are very powerful too. And this is the moment to sort of grab that together. So anyway, that's.
Pam, I think
That
Pam
was
wanted
going to be
to
my
add to it.
add-on to that. Something you led off with when you were talking about how to raise money. And you said, as Obama did, through the internet. The power of the internet. That's the tool that's here now that hasn't there and wasn't there before. That's the kind of tool, too, that can energize, engage people, and start building the momentum. And while they're the political naysayers and the opponents, the more momentum you can get, this kind of thing can get going, the more that it's taking has traction, the more it's going to get people's attention, and they're going to try to figure out, okay, I can fight it, but how can I be part of the process too? And to build it big enough. And I was thinking too, as I was thinking a little bit, it's like the brainstorming kind of thing too. But just think, you get this rolling. Who's going to use this kind of website? It's people who aren't going to be members of the Constitution. They're not going to be doing it, participating or going to the meetings, but it's going to be the curriculum in a school. It can be the curriculum in social studies. The kids are going to say, hey, my state's doing a constitutional convention. Have not done it for 150 years. This is pretty exciting. What do we want the state to be? So building a curriculum around that, helping teachers to engage the students, that all trickles up to parents. You can build a real movement around this, I think.
I agree.
And challenge
Right
the
on,
powers
Ed.
that be.
Briefly, I mentioned to you about studying all these different places that have used these sort of citizen delegate processes, and what you really see is that it is transformative. First of all, for the delegates themselves who participate, they become changed by the process, and they every one of them become change agents because they go back to where they live, and they start talking to their neighbors. They become mini celebrities where they live, starting to talk about being involved in this process. And that encourages the kind of over-the-fence type of conversations about democracy that need to occur in California. And you see this in other places actually going on. So I really think that what we may be able to do through this process is really create an army of people like yourselves who are going to go out and talk to people where you work, talk to your friends, to your family members, take some of the literature out there on the table, and give it to people and say, hey, I went to this event last night, heard some talk, it was kind of interesting. Check out the website, start using the internet. I mean, all of us at that point becomes change agents to make the change that we think California needs to have.
Okay, we have a question about how would the transition be managed? How do we go from the old Constitution to a new one? What becomes of the elements of the old one that aren't addressed? And this person's hoping that a lot of junk in the old Constitution will go away. And then a follow-up, too, would be, what about the new legislature? How do we ensure that they don't fall into old patterns? How do we ensure that they're not, doing legislation to make sure that their names are on bills so they get reelected? How do we avoid the old habits?
Well, and those are really tough questions. I mean, the legislature reflects us. I mean, you have 2/3 vote in the legislature. They are reflecting their constituents. 2/3 of Californians really can't agree on the budget either, I don't think. Californians want to be taxed less and to spend more, but you just can't do it. You can do it at the federal government. That's what Obama and the Congress are doing. They're reducing taxes and they're increasing spending. We can't do it here. So we have to remember that the legislature is very reflective, actually, of us. The problem is the process. When we have term limits, we've sent new people up there, and we still have problems with the new people up there. Why is that? It's not because they're bad people. It's because the process really wears them down. And so what we have to do is change that process and then watch what the legislature does and watch our legislators and ensure that they represent us.
Mark?
Again, a part of the transition issues is, we can move, the convention might, for instance, move things that are in the Constitution now and move them into statutory law, not change them, but take them out of the fundamental document and put them in, move them to statute so that then they're subject to the normal processes of government.
California's constitution is 5 times thicker than the US Constitution, because it's just by so many initiative processes and amendment changes, it's just, and most of it should be in statute.
Right.
Yeah, I would caution, we didn't get here overnight, and we don't get out of this overnight. So, one of the criticisms of the convention that's been raised is, well, it's not fast acting enough, and, everybody wants a quick fix, and we need some quick fixes. And I think some of the other things that have been talked about should forge ahead, because we need action. But in terms of the fixing the Constitution and the effects that it would have, it might take a few years, to get this done in the first place, and a few years as well to sort of begin to see the positive effects of the change. But that shouldn't dissuade us. We've been here for a while. We probably intend to stay. And, let's get it going now, sooner the better, and have realistic expectations about the time it will take to heal these wounds. It's not going to happen overnight.
Is how can we be certain that it's going to cover a certain scope, and how is that scope going to be decided?
Well, I think you can limit what can be in the Constitutional Convention, and that's, the proposals I've seen have limited it to process questions, not gay rights, not abortion, and so they won't be able to cover a whole bunch of things. But at the same time, you want to give them some independence to solve the problems, and so it's a real balance. And obviously, there's always a great fear of the unknown. And that's the biggest problem we have, is people, if they're not sure, will vote no. And that's why I was so surprised in terms of the redistricting commission. It passed because in the past measures had failed. So we have to convince Californians that the status quo is worse than the fear of possible change.
Well, and also don't forget that whatever the convention comes up with is going to go on the ballot. So voters will ultimately be the ones who decide whether or not those changes will go in. And so there's a number of checks in there that, to prevent the runaway convention sort of thing. In addition to limiting the scope of the mandate, voters in the end will get to decide.
And just a thought, when the voters survive, then we're back to money and who's supporting the various positions. But to the next question, we had a number of people in different words really ask, is California just too big and complex to be governed, period? And with various approaches, looking at 4 regions, 2 regions, splitting the state, folks are interested in your opinion. And maybe, Julia, we'll start with you, since you are in the legislature.
Well, I think that, over time, for me, the 2/3 is a big issue, and I think it has played out in California for a very long time. And as a consequence, we have had lots and lots of initiatives. And so when you look at California's budget, it was mentioned before, there's Prop 98 that guarantees the school funding, which is a very large part of the budget. There's prisons, because we, the people, we've put initiatives on the ballot and so forth, and we've voted in 3 strikes, and we've done this, and so our prisons are overcrowded, and we don't have enough prisons. We have to build prisons. We're under receivership, and then we have initiatives that money is committed to certain things, and the legislature doesn't have any control over that. And so I think, just over time, the sort of inability really for California to govern, and I think Californians have come to this place where they believe that we don't have to raise taxes and we can have all of the services that they want, and they just feel like it's magic. But indeed, it's not magic, and that's where our structural deficit in the budget has come from all of these pressures, and because we've borrow money. The governor, when he was first elected, he got rid of the vehicle license fee. If we had the vehicle license fee in place right now, we wouldn't have this $26 billion problem on our hand. And so anyway, so I think it's those kinds of issues that force us in to this problematic area. California's gotten accustomed to this. The governor, when he first came, he also, we passed an initiative for California to have a $15 billion credit card we used it up in a heartbeat. So we have the budget, we have debt to pay in our budget. So it's, that's what it is. And so we can't, we're not in a place where we can really govern, where we can create a budget that really represents what California wants, where we can potentially invest on the front end so that we save on the back end. I mean, California is just the opposite. Because of all of these restrictions, we're always patching things together, and of course it takes us months after a budget deadline to do it, but we patch something together to get ourselves to the next place. And so we have band-aided ourselves for the last decade, and that's where the perfect storm in California came, because the global economy tanked, and California has been suffering for a decade, and boom, California got hit harder than anybody else. And when the overall global economy recovers, California's going to lag far behind because we're limited by how we can govern.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that the global economy tanked, it's that California doesn't have the means to respond. I mean, you look at the federal level, every economist, whether it's Krugman, Stiglitz, or even conservative economists, say that when consumer spending plummets like it has, the government has to step in to prime the pump. I mean, we're in classic Keynesian sort of economics at this point. But California can't prime the pump. All California can do is cut, because there's no way to increase taxes, or there's no way for the government to spend the money like the federal government is doing. So, I mean, it's really, to me, it's the rules that we're living by that is really the problem. Capitalist economies go through up and down cycles. It always will be that way. Right. It's whether you have the tools to respond when that happens, and we don't have the tools. Right. And that's what I think what we're trying to do here is we're trying to redesign California to give ourselves the tools that we need going forward to be the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world and be able to, I mean, just the fact that for every dollar in federal taxes that we send to Washington, we only get back 75 cents.
50 billion to DC.
I mean, whereas Alaska, for every dollar they send, they get back about $4.50.
Right.
So, there's lots of parts to this that need to be known and understood and discussed, and as we decide what tools we need to make this better in the future.
We're going to run out of time soon, and we have one question from the audience that I think makes for an interesting last question. And the person asked, has any state designed a structure that does work?
Does any state?
Any state. I'm sure you can expand it to...
Germany. Germany's about the size of California, 80 million people, and all their people have health care and, paid parental leave and sick leave and vacations, and I mean, they're having an economic hard time too, but I think we should look at other places.
They're a leader in solar panels and solar energy when, they don't have really great weather, and here they are, really moving that issue forward.
What's the voting system they have in Germany?
Well, they have a multi-party system where you have more than two points of view, and these districts that are just, bunker down partisan districts where only one side can win. So they have proportional representation, they have public financing of campaigns, they have free airtime for the candidates, so they have a real robust conversation about these sorts of things. And they're having very robust conversations right now about the economic crisis in their countries as well. So I think it is, as Mark Paul said, the economic crisis is related to a political crisis, where our political institutions in California, as well in the United States, are rooted in the 18th century. Right. I mean, the idea of having the single-member district system that we have, where you only have one representative and it's bunkered down, red, blue, all these sorts of things. I mean, that system right now, I think, is really, it's that question whether that is the system for the 21st century and whether there isn't something better out there that would give voters more points of view to pick from and have more robust conversations on issues in the legislature, outside the legislature, in the media, et cetera.
So in answer to the audience member's question, I didn't hear anybody with an example of a structure that works in the United States.
Well, I mean, other states people are much happier with their state governments than they are in California. Mm-hmm. I come from Wisconsin. It doesn't have an initiative system, et cetera. I mean, all of politics is directed through the legislative and gubernatorial elections, and they fight about policy, but nobody talks about Wisconsin being ungovernable.
We're not fighting policy, we don't have a good government.
A lot of you have talked about how to get more input into this process. And obviously, we've been limited by time. The sheet of paper that we had there, what did we call it? The exercise to suggest your interest. We're going to have people at the doors when you go out. Please finish those and hand them in, because those are going to go and help inform the folks who are trying to draft the scope of the ballot measure. So it's really critical. Also, people talked about diversity of the crowd and the speakers tonight. These meetings are being held in very different communities all over California, and to some degree they're reflective of the communities that they're in. So this is not just happening on the west side or just in San Francisco. It's happening all over. USC tomorrow, a very east side oriented event as well. So it's coming from a lot of different perspectives. Finally, if you want to engage some of our panelists, we've got a lot of wonderful nosh out there. There's great food from Whole Foods and from Co-Opportunity. Please stay for the reception, and you can ask them questions and just network with everybody individually. With that, thank you so much for coming out and trying to improve our state. Good night.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes.
Get one of those.